turn to Genesis 14. I'm going to read all of Genesis 14, but I'll need to start by reading verse 18 in chapter 13, and then we'll read all of Genesis 14. So if you have a copy of God's word, which I hope you do, either open it or for some of you, turn it on. And let us read Genesis chapter 3, verse 18 through chapter 14. Then Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to Yahweh. And it happened in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, Chedor Laomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, and with Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zoboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Now for 12 years they had served Chedor Laomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. So in the 14th year, Chedor Laomer and the kings that were with him came and struck the Rephaim in the Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Imim in Shavah Kirathaim, and the Horites in Mount Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they struck all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who were living in Chazan Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arranged themselves for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedor Laomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Eleazar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who remained behind fled to the hill country. Then they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed. Now he was living in Sodom. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was dwelling by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorites, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were in a covenant with Abram. So Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, and he led out his trained men born in his house, 318 in number, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his men against them by night, he and his servants, and struck them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. Then after he came back from striking down Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sevet, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Then he gave him a tenth of all. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give the people to me, but take the possessions for yourself. Then Abram said to the king of Sodom, I've raised my hand to Yahweh, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you would not say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Anor, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share. Well, this very interesting chapter in the book of Genesis is going to present for us another obstacle to God's covenant promises to Abram, and the agent in one sense that really brings about this challenge, this obstacle to the covenant promise of the land to Abram is his nephew, Lot. We are able to see through this that God has promised to give mercy to sinful mankind, the sons and daughters of Adam, not because they deserve it, but God was just pleased to be gracious. And we have seen that one man out of all of them undeserving, but yet God chose one man, Abram, and he has covenanted to Abraham certain blessings to him. And these blessings, in one sense, can be categorized into two main groups, land and seed. And here what we are able to see, that because of his kinsmen, in one sense, that's kind of connected to the issue of seed, the challenge is brought about the promise of the land. But yet we will find in this passage that God's covenant promises to be able to bring to pass salvation for his people, again, do not hinge upon man's abilities, but rather upon God's faithfulness. This is going to enable us to understand how God is keeping his promises to Abraham. Genesis 14 will advance our understanding of how God is bringing to pass redemption according to his covenant promises. And maybe at the highest level, we could just initially realize, do the promises come to fulfillment by going around difficulty and opposition, or rather by going through it? We clearly see that God is going to bring about fulfillment not by going around opposition to his covenant promises, but rather by going through them and overcoming them. So before we get into sort of three divisions of this chapter that will take us to learn these things, I do think I want to present three ways, Christian, that even at the outset, you need to be looking for in Genesis 14. Number one, as we go through this chapter, we should imitate Abram in his faith in God's promise in the face of opposition. We'll see a good picture from Abraham's faith in this chapter. It's not always the case with Abraham, but in chapter 14, it is the case. We should imitate Abram's faith by trusting in God's promises in the face of the greatest oppositions. Number two, we do have to realize from Genesis 14 that Christ and his redemptive work is the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. But in a greater way, one that is being unfolded for us as we continue to work through God's word, and therefore the way in which redemptive history is unfolding and progressing, in one sense, starting very explicitly and clearly with the promises made to Abraham, but eventually will cover the whole earth. Jesus is the one who brings the fulfillment in its full of these covenant promises. And lastly, we need to know, and Genesis 14 does teach us, we need to know that God's plan has always been for Jesus to be the high priest and king over all his redeemed people, including Abraham. So those are some practical things that Genesis 14 is going to give us, but let's see how it does teach us these things. First, before we get to chapter 14, the conclusion of the events of chapter 13 have Abram enjoying temporary peace in the land God has promised him. In verse 18, you are able to see that Abram, he is back in Hebron. He has built an altar to Yahweh, his covenant God, and there, on the basis of sacrifice and through faith in that sacrifice, Abram is both offering up to Yahweh worship as well as proclaiming his name. In one sense, that is like a kernel form, or some people would want to say that is a type of everything that is going to be developing through the rest of Scripture. That God's redemptive promise is to bring God's people into God's promised place so that they will worship him. So while incomplete, there is still, in essence, a clear picture of what is God bringing about for people. Now we see in Abraham, but eventually for people whom God will call to the Messiah, the seed of Abraham from all nations. And that would be enter into the promised place where you have peace with God and you will enjoy worshiping forever. Unhindered by enemy, whether that be sin within or without. And so we see in verse 18, in one sense, we could say kind of a temporal blessing, a foretaste, if you will, of what God will forever and finally bring through Jesus Christ. But then we notice in verse 1, it is interrupted. And I would just want you to observe kind of this paradigm, this pattern, which will be over and over and over the case as we travel through the Old Testament. And then we will see how Jesus would come and he fulfills the promises. And then we read of the church and we find they too suffer. While enjoying the foretaste, it will be interrupted with persecutions and oppositions. And what breaks this period of peace for Abram, living in Hebron, worshiping Yahweh, is what we can rightly call, at least in the time that we're reading about it, it is a world war. International war is now what interrupts Abram's peace in the land, worshiping Yahweh. And we are given the backstory of how this came to interrupt Abram. I mean, what does this really have to do with Abram? Did my best to try to pronounce these kings and their lands. And that is, entertaining if you enjoy laughing at people just trying to hear me say these words. But nonetheless, there's significance in this that we need to understand. And that is if you were to look at what has been promised to Abram and where he is, you realize everything is centered geographically in Canaan. The worldview, so to speak, the lens of Scripture is really small. It's not wide angle. And there is one man and one place, and everything has hinged upon promises Yahweh has made to just this man and just this land. Now, the whole world hinges upon those promises, but we have a really narrow attention in the narrative. We're not interested in international geopolitical war. We're interested in Abraham and Canaan. And in one sense, if you would imagine, it sounds like God is an isolationist, doesn't it? I mean, what does it really matter what happens in these other nations? Abraham is my man and Canaan is my land. We could just, if they want to kill one another, create treaties with one another, alliances and confederations with one another, sure, let them do so. But Abraham and Canaan is where we are giving our attention and our focuses, because indeed our hopes hinge upon him. But the problem is that's not the way it goes. The wars of the world now break into Abram's life, and that's because of Lot, his nephew. And so the backstory, as you have seen, is that the kings, there were 4 of them, and in one sense, we rightly should group them into Babylon. Indeed, one of the kings is king of Babylon. When it says Shinar in Genesis 10, we have already seen Shinar is, in one sense, immediately associated with Babylon. That is modern day Iraq. And so one of these kings is the king of Babylon, the area that we now call Iraq. And so we do have literally Ampharael, the king of Shinar, we could say king of Babylon. And then these other 3 kings, they are kings of the modern nations or places that we call Iran and Turkey. So these kings are coming from that part of the world, which is not, in one sense, on Abram's horizon. He's not concerned about them. He's mainly been dealing with Lot and the people who were in the land of Canaan. But because the cities, and in one sense, we should think in terms of the way we think about nation states today, you might need to think about city states in this particular time. There were 5 city states, so to speak, in the area around the Dead Sea. Lot happened to dwell in one of those city states, Sodom. And these 5 city states around the Dead Sea, we're able to see it was called the Salt Sea in verse 3. They actually were under the foot, so to speak, of the king of Babylon. Which it kind of works like this, just in case you're wondering, and things really don't change in the world, so it still kind of works this way. Nations or city-states or nation-states, it doesn't matter, whatever the particular arrangement of the place in history are, it's kind of like mafia, just applied to nations. And that is, the mafia goes around and they would say, you know, if you want the blessing of our protection, you're going to get us a cut of your business. But if you don't want to give us a cut of your business, then not only will you not enjoy our protection, you will now get our boot on your neck. Okay, that's how organized crime works. Well, that's also how politics works. And so the confederation, or you can give it whatever fancy word you want, the coalition of these 4 kings that are united with the king of Babylon, they have had the 5 city-states around the Dead Sea. They've had them under their boot, but now 12 years is up and they think they don't have to have the boot on their neck anymore. And so they now make an alliance with themselves and they rebel against the king of Babylon. And what do you have to do? You're either going to have a debate that works like this, is, okay, we'll agree that you now can have some kind of autonomy. And so that's what ambassadors do. They try to make those kinds of debates. Or you can have a debate that comes by the end of a sword. And just in case we're wondering, debate has always been waged this way, and today it is continuing to be waged this way. And so the king of Babylon and his allied four kings, again, you need to think this is the world. This is not the Canaanites. This is the world now comes into Abraham's neighborhood with their armies, and they assemble to enforce their will against these 5 city-states around the Dead Sea. And indeed, they are amazingly successful. I don't think, Jeff, you could tell me, but I don't think they're writing about this particular military battle in the annals of military history. But if you were going to read what Moses writes for us when he sort of walks us through the victory that they are achieving as they are coming into the city-states around the Dead Sea, and then as they make their way back through Canaan, and once they are whooping everyone. And the first one that they're able to whoop up on were considered to be like the giants. That is the first people that they are able to face, which in one sense indicates what kind of reputation does this coalition have under the king of Babylon? This is the greatest fighting force in the world. So that's the backstory. Babylon, and we don't need to miss the connection with Babylon. The world in its unified coalition comes against these city-states and they destroy everyone they are seeking to conquer on their way back. Not only those 5 cities who thought that they could rebel against them, but they will come through Abram's land, and no one can stop them. So that's the backstory, but really the backstory tells us the significance of this incredible military force, which is Babylon and the coalition of these 4 kings from the east of Mesopotamia. But the real hook for us is Abram's nephew. Which, like, if you're reading books, I imagine that you're not probably going to pick up the way Moses would write history. I mean, Moses probably is not going to write a good Netflix series here. Like, if I'm going to watch some kind of military sort of, fiction, and Moses is interested in Lot. I mean, I'm not interested in Lot. I want to see, like, how did they win? Like, show me them fighting. And the way that we come after the backstory, look at verse 12. They also took Lot. Abram's nephew, and his possessions, and departed. And then we're told why. Because now he was living in Sodom. Now, this is pretty interesting when we just consider, you remember in chapter 13 that there was a conflict or strife that emerged between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen because they were rich and the land would not support both of them. And Lot was given a choice, and he chose the Jordan Valley. And we were told that he moved his tents close to Sodom. But now what we are able to learn is he didn't stay close to Sodom. He actually moved into Sodom. And you may also remember that Moses tells us in chapter 13 that Sodom, they were great sinners against Yahweh. So again, when I say things like, if I were your God, like, hopefully you know that is just a rhetorical device to show you that you do not want anyone other than Yahweh to be your God. You do not want any man in any way to sort of serve in the place of your God. No mediators other than the Lord Jesus Christ, the God man, between you and your God, because all men are evil. And so I'm just able to immediately and easily illustrate with why you would certainly not want me. But again, if I just pretend for a moment, if Lot is my nephew, and Lot chose to pitch his tent close to Sodom, those evil sinners in Yahweh's sight, what would I think about my nephew? Stupid nephew. If you would just listen to me, your desire to be as close as you can to the world, to look at its ways and its works, to learn from it because you lust after. I could go into multiple lectures for my nephew. And then if I found him that he actually is living in Sodom, I'm like, Lot, I'm sorry. There's natural consequences for sin. And what happens to Sodom from these Babylonian coalition kings, that's a natural consequence to your worldliness, to the fact that you were unwise, that you were a fool. I could go, Proverbs all on Lot, my nephew. But Moses is telling us the hook that really now gets Abram involved in this conflict is his nephew Lot, because he is captured. Which this now helps us to read. So why does this matter? We're not told any of the flashy details about the war. We're just told about Lot. Because this is the way Abram now, this is really amazing. We now are able to see something that we may have not explicitly had handed to us. Abram is a king. And Lot is a part of his people. See, Abram here is called the Hebrew, first time. And Lot is his kinsman. And this land has been given to Abram by Yahweh, and it is for him and his kinsmen, the people who will come for him. That means Lot is a part of this. And so, in one sense, we are able to see, because Abram now responds in verse 14, like a king responds when someone comes into their kingdom and takes their citizens, in this case, their kinsmen. A noble, courageous king now will not chastise, in this case, even their worldly and unwise kinsmen, but rather will do their noble duty as king and defend the people that God has given to them. Which is to say, this is the expression not only of Abram as king in the land God has given to him, but Abram as believer in God's promises to him. Because this now is getting on his land, and they have taken his people, Lot. And so verse 14, we're said this is what he does. This also kind of opens the door for us to see that Abram is like a king in Hebron, though the land has not been given to him as the promise is contained, in the sense of it has not been accomplished, but the promise has been given. But we are able to see that Abram is a rich man, and he actually has, we'll just call them special forces. I'm not quite sure what the analogy would be, but we're told in verse 14 that Abram takes out his trained men. He leads them. Like a king in the old school way, the king would lead his warriors to battle. So Abram, in the same manner, leads his trained men out. We're told in number they are 318, and they go, that is, in pursuit of the coalition of the Babylonian Empire to the northern region of the promised land, Dan, which is about 120 miles. Now, again, we have already been told they are pursuing, in one sense, what is a dominant military force that has never been seen before. And Abram and 318 of his special forces are pursuing this dominant military force of the Babylonian Empire into Dan. And then verse 15, and this is why you wouldn't want Moses writing your Netflix series, because he just sums it up like this. And he divided his men against them by night, and he and his servants, and struck them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. You're like, oh, that was like, that's all the good stuff. Like, you're just going to give me one sentence that summarizes how 318 people plus Abram can somehow defeat the world's military juggernaut? Like, you got at least 3 seasons out of that. Now, here's what we are able to say. It seems on the basis of his ability to divide them, and then under the cover of darkness, that Abram was able to defeat the Babylonian coalition forces. I would want you to be able to make a few things that you do have to have as categories. When we see that because of Lot, and the way Lot is a part of the covenant promises to Abram, world politics now becomes an issue that Abram, he cannot be an isolationist because of the covenant promises. He's not on a social justice campaign. He's acting in faith to the covenant promises that Yahweh has made to him. And indeed, this is incredible faith. Kent Hughes chooses to render the expression of Abram's faith in Genesis 14 as his faith now makes Abraham not only Abram the believer, but Abram the general. And what God has promised to him, Abram is absolutely confident God will give to him. And as king over this land, he takes the resources that he actually has deliberately trained for such a time as this to be able to recover Lot and his family and possessions. That's why Abram enters into what we'll call geopolitics of the world. It is because of his faith in Yahweh's covenant promises to him. And indeed, he believes that Yahweh will give him what he has promised, and that includes Lot will not be captured and taken away by Babylon. And Babylon will not come and run through his land as if God has not given it to him. Now, this is where in the Old Testament you're able to see that the way one begins to be helped to have expectations for another one coming is not always going to be as clean and tidy as we may hope, because who does Abram sound like right now? His worldly, unwise nephew Lot, who is his kinsman. Because of his own stupidity and folly, gets taken away by the wicked kings, and Abraham, with his resources, enters into the war in order to rescue lost Lot. Does that remind you, say, of another seed of Abraham? Namely, Jesus Christ. We therefore have in one passage, in one sense, these kinds of expectations of how God is at work in the world through his promised one. But then this also gives an occasion for another strange individual to come to us. who will give us yet another expectation for God to fulfill in the future. And that is because after Abram enters into the geopolitical conflict that these Babylonian kings took up with the 5 city-states around the Dead Sea, we're able to see in verse 16 that Abram and his forces bring back all of the spoil, which was both possessions and peoples, from the coalition of Babylon, such that now those 5 city-states around the Dead Sea, they now receive back what was taken from them. Verse 16 tells us that he, Abraham, brought back all the possessions. And he also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people. Abraham got what he wanted, Lot, but he also got what all these other kings around the Dead Sea wanted. And so in verse 17, we come to the sort of the last scene. And this is going to show us yet again God's faithfulness and Abraham's faith. But these 2 kings come out to a particular location, which seems to be just a little bit south of Jerusalem. It's called the Valley of the Kings, or the King's Valley. And there are 2 kings who come out. We'll take the king of Sodom first. Now, we've seen that one king of Sodom is told to have died in the tar pits. And so this must have been, in that sense, the kind of replacement succession had been set up. But the king of Sodom is going to be, in one sense, directly contrast with the king of Salem. And what we're going to be able to see is these 2 kings, they respond to Abram in totally different ways. Not in ways that are just different, but in ways that are actually the opposite. And here we get another geopolitical message. And that is, it really does matter how the nations or city-states or kings, how do they respond to Abraham? So let's look at the worldly response of the wicked king of Sodom. Just in case you're not picking up, this is the example you do not want to imitate. The king of Sodom comes to Abram, who has brought back all of the booty that the Babylonian coalition took from Sodom. And the way that he responds to Abram, look at verse 22. I'm sorry, 21. Give the people to me, but take the possessions for yourself. What does the king of Sodom obviously understand? I understand how the mafia works. I mean, it's kind of got its place. I mean, mercenaries have had sort of a kind of business niche in warfare for a really long time. I think they still have it today. If I'm mistaken, I think it's called contracting. But in that sense, he's like, I get it. You have indeed done me a great service, and here's your cut. You can take all the stuff. I want my people back. Now, what kind of proposition is that for Abram, and what kind of sort of relationship framework does the king of Sodom want? King of Sodom is like, this is a business transaction. You have achieved this, and I have a benefit from what you've done, and I want to pay you a cut for it, which would make the king of Sodom, he would be giving something to Abram that Abram worked to get. Which would also say, why did Abram engage in war with the Babylonian coalition to begin with? Well, if he takes a cut from the king of Sodom, then it would rightly be it's because you wanted those possessions. That's not why Abram went to war. Abram went to war to get Lot, and that's because God promised his kinsmen would be a part of his people in his place. He did not want anything that would not be from his faith in God's covenant promises. And the king of Sodom is not interested in being blessed by blessing Abraham. He's wanting to make a political deal. So how does Abram respond to the offer of the king of Sodom? And verse 22 tells us. Abram said, I raised my hand to Yahweh, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you would not say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten and what the share of the men who went with me. Let them take their share. In one sense, I'm going to say that this is the public profession of Abram's faith in Yahweh's promise in the context of the witnesses of the king of Sodom. I'm not going to receive anything that is not from Yahweh according to his covenant promises that will only be given to me on the basis of faith. It will not be because of my works, and it will not come from your hand. So he refuses. You just can, in one sense, you can give him a per diem. They were gone this many days and this many nights, and that required a certain amount of food. And so let them have their per diem. But I'm not taking anything that you give to me because of what I did. In case you're wondering, we're going to find out that indeed the king of Sodom is not the example that nations and kings should follow. He does not understand who Abram is in God's redemptive plan. The king of Salem, however, does. And here we are able to see that Melchizedek, which, if you were to break down what that means by the etymology, it is the king of righteousness. We are told that he actually responds rightly. Verse 18 tells us that he is the king of Salem. Salem, you may know, means peace. And so he is the king of peace, the king of righteousness. I think actually Salem is just referring to Jerusalem. So I think that this is not the pre-incarnate Son of God that came to earth to bless Abraham. I think this is actually a Canaanite king from Jerusalem at this time, that he comes out and he functions according to what he is. That is, he is a priest of God Most High. And we see Abram in verse 22, he uses the same nomenclature for God and connects it with Yahweh, which I think forces us to rightly understand that Melchizedek actually is a priest of Yahweh. Which, if you're wondering, like, whoa, that sort of like messes everything up. That's the point. That there is a priest that does not have its lineage from Abraham's seed, who in one sense has no beginning. We do not know of his end. And yet he is both a priest and a king. And he comes, and you notice in verse 19, after we know that he is a priest of the Most High God, the king of Salem, Melchizedek, he brings in one sense what would be a royal sort of meal of blessing. Kind of think this is a banquet, bread and wine. Abram, he sees as he is victorious, and so he brings out to him in one sense, a meal of blessing that celebrates Abram's victory. Bread and wine. And then verses 19 and 20, what does he do? He does what priests should do. He blesses both Abram and God for the victory God has given to Abram. We see in verse 19, blessed be Abram of God Most High, and it is God Most High is the possessor of heaven and earth. And then in verse 20, he blesses God Most High, and then he attributes in this blessing Abram's victory to God, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Do you see how that is the total opposite response to Abram's victory from the king of Sodom? See, Melchizedek sees, in one sense, the geopolitical conflicts that bring Abram in such that he defeats the Babylonian coalition because Yahweh is the center and ruler of all the earth. And Yahweh has made promises to this man, Abram, and Yahweh has given his enemies into Abram's hand. So Yahweh is to be blessed for Abram's victory. In case you're wondering about sort of Christian geopolitics, I would say that's called a primer into Christian geopolitical views. No king or coalition comes and does anything unless Yahweh has not providentially ordained what they do. And those who have victory and those who suffer defeat, they will ultimately be brought to the very place where Yahweh will give to his ultimate seed of Abraham all nations and all lands, and Abram and his descendants will be placed where God has promised to them. And who will be blessed for it? Indeed, God's people will be blessed, but ultimately God will be blessed in it. Now, categorically, it means that you have to understand sometimes we're able to see that believers are warriors. Pacifism is not consistent with Christian faith. If you believe, sometimes you will have to fight. We also are able to see that God's promises to be brought to fulfillment are going to come through the results of war. Does that mean war is good? No. If you read what the Mesopotamians would do, I mean, it seems like they wrote the original book of wickedness in warfare. In no way is it justifying those wicked, sinful acts as war. God actually will punish them for it. But at the same time, we are able to see God is going to achieve fulfillment of his covenant promises that bring forth ultimate redemption in Jesus Christ, and it will include war. But the end of it is going to be God giving the victory to the one he has promised, and God will be blessed for it. And so what does Abram do in response to this king of Salem? He does the opposite of what he did to the king of Sodom. The last sentence in verse 20 says that he gave a tenth of all to Melchizedek. Now that's what a tithe is. The 10% of the spoils he gave to the priest and king Melchizedek. Which means if you are giving something to him, you are indicating that there is a way in which you know he is greater than I am. Abram gave this to Melchizedek. The father of our faith gave a priestly tithe from the booty of God's blessings to him to this priest and king. Now that sort of is just the circuit jammer. You're like, I don't, how does that fit? And that's exactly what is supposed to happen, is that we have now, from Genesis 14 forward, we have this category that even Abraham, the father of our faith, knows that there is one who is a king and a priest of Yahweh, and he gave to him a priestly tithe. Well, we read earlier from the book of Hebrews, which gives extended exposition of Jesus as the priest in the order of Melchizedek, indicating that Melchizedek is teaching us that ultimately God has always planned for Jesus to be the high priest and king over all of God's people, including Abraham. And so while Melchizedek is not the visitation of the Son of God in a pre-incarnate form, it's an actual man from Salem, therefore a Canaanite, we are able to see that indeed God's ultimate plan of redemption is going to come from someone who is greater than Abraham. Now, that might not hit you as a Christian as like a significant thing. And the reason is because you're not Jewish. You're Christian. But if you're going to say to someone whose framework of the covenant blessings makes Abraham the greatest, here you have Abraham giving a tenth to a king and priest. That indicates to those who would think Judaism is God's religion, you misunderstand Judaism. Judaism indeed was the framework to point us to the Messiah, who is not only Savior of the Jews, but of the Gentiles. And just like Abraham gave this tithe to this king and priest, so too there is a greater one than Abraham. This is the expectation that is now set. And what we're able to see in verses 22 through 24 is the response of Abraham to these two kings who had two opposite responses to God's victory through Abraham. As Abram now makes public his profession of faith among the nations of Yahweh's promise to him. He refuses the king of Sodom's works-based tribute and receives and then blesses with a tithe Melchizedek. As you move forward in this, and we'll go to chapter 15, and it's incredibly significant. What is not immediately apparent, but will be apparent. If you were to go forward and read in the book of Moses, say like Deuteronomy chapter 21, you're going to find explicit laws related to what do you do if you go to war and you receive spoils. How would you please Yahweh in those situations? Well, what is said in the Mosaic law is actually kept here by Abraham, indicating for us, just by way of narrative example, how did Abraham relate to Yahweh's promises? He believed. And Abram's life is lived in accordance with God's moral requirements. What we'll find out as we go further is in the Sinaitic covenant, and the covenant that Israel made with Yahweh through Moses at Sinai, they're not able to keep the law. Abraham was, and he didn't even have it. Because Abraham approached God by faith in his redemptive promises. So, Genesis 14 shows us, indeed, we need to imitate the bold faith of General Abraham, and at the same time see that this is how God achieves his redemptive promises in the face of opposition. If you have questions, come and talk.